The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Margaret Maggie Chen pushed her cart through the narrow aisles of Patterson's Family Market on that humid August afternoon in 1992. The small grocery store in Cedar Falls, Iowa, was a familiar sanctuary for the 34-year-old accountant and her 5-year-old daughter Emma. The scent of fresh bread from the bakery section mixed with the cool air conditioning, providing relief from the oppressive summer heat that had settled over the Midwest for weeks. Emma skipped alongside her mother, her small hands occasionally reaching for colorful packages on the lower shelves. Her bright red sneakers squeaked against the linoleum floor, and her blonde pigtails bounced with each step. She wore her favorite purple t-shirt with a cartoon unicorn, a gift from her grandmother that she insisted on wearing almost daily, much to Maggie's gentle protests about variety in wardrobe choices. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us as we continue to bring you these compelling true stories. "Mommy, can we get the cereal with the toy inside?" Emma asked, tugging on Maggie's denim skirt as they approached the breakfast aisle. Her voice carried the innocent enthusiasm that only a 5-year-old could possess, each word filled with hope and expectation. Maggie smiled down at her daughter, momentarily setting aside her mental grocery list to focus on Emma's bright blue eyes. "We'll see, sweetheart. Let's get the important things first, okay?" She had always been practical about purchases, especially since her divorce from Emma's father, Robert, had been finalized just 6 months earlier. Money was tighter now, but she was determined to maintain stability for Emma. The store was unusually busy for a Tuesday afternoon. Back-to-school shopping had begun in earnest, and families were stocking up before the upcoming semester. Maggie navigated through clusters of other shoppers, keeping one eye on her list and another on Emma, who had developed a habit of wandering toward anything that caught her attention. As they reached the produce section, Maggie became engrossed in selecting the ripest tomatoes for the week's meals. She squeezed each one gently, checking for the perfect balance of firmness and give. The routine was meditative, almost therapeutic after the stress of recent months. The divorce had been messy, with Robert fighting for custody despite his inconsistent presence in Emma's life. The legal battles had drained both her finances and emotional reserves. The afternoon felt ordinary in every way, the kind of mundane Tuesday that would typically fade into the background of memory within days. Maggie had no way of knowing that these moments, these simple interactions between mother and daughter, would become precious artifacts she would examine obsessively for decades to come. The way Emma's nose wrinkled when she disagreed with something, the musical quality of her laugh when she found something amusing, the way she held Maggie's hand with complete trust as they navigated through the crowded store. Near the meat counter, a tall man in a blue work shirt smiled at Emma and commented on how cute she was. It was the kind of innocent interaction that happened daily in small-town Iowa, strangers being friendly, acknowledging children with warmth. Maggie smiled politely and continued shopping, thinking nothing of the encounter. The man had kind eyes and a gentle voice when he said, "What a beautiful little girl you have there." Emma, always sociable, had waved shyly before hiding behind Maggie's legs. "Emma, what do you think about corn on the cob tonight?" Maggie asked, turning toward where her daughter had been standing just moments before. But the space beside the cart was empty. The purple unicorn shirt was nowhere to be seen among the produce displays. The transition from normal to nightmare happened in the span of a heartbeat. One moment Emma was there, reaching for a shiny red apple, and the next, she had simply vanished. "Emma?" Maggie's voice carried a note of concern as she looked down the adjacent aisle. Children wandered off all the time in stores. She reminded herself not to panic. "Emma, honey, where are you?" But even as she spoke the words, a cold dread began to settle in her stomach. Emma was generally obedient, and she had been right beside the cart only seconds before. She pushed her cart quickly toward the end of the aisle, scanning left and right. The store suddenly seemed enormous, its familiar layout now transformed into a maze of potential hiding places. Other shoppers continued their routines, oblivious to the growing knot of anxiety in Maggie's stomach. The normalcy of their behavior, selecting groceries, checking lists, managing their own children, felt surreal against the backdrop of her rising panic. "Excuse me." She approached a teenage employee stocking shelves with canned goods. "Have you seen a little girl in a purple shirt, blonde pigtails? She was just with me." The boy, barely 17, with acne-scarred cheeks and a name tag reading Kyle, shook his head sympathetically, but immediately abandoned his task to help search. Together, they moved through the store systematically, checking every aisle, every end cap display, every corner where a curious 5-year-old might have wandered. Maggie's heart rate increased with each empty aisle. She called Emma's name louder now, not caring about the attention she was drawing from other customers. The sound of her own voice, increasingly desperate, seemed to echo strangely in the familiar space. Several shoppers joined the search without being asked, their own parental instincts activated by the unmistakable sound of a mother's growing fear. An elderly woman with kind eyes suggested checking the bathroom. A middle-aged father of 3 began looking under displays and behind counters. The community response was immediate and heartwarming, but with each passing minute and each empty space searched, the reality became increasingly clear. Emma wasn't hiding in the store. Store manager Bill Patterson, whose family had owned the market for 3 generations, had seen lost children before. They almost always turned up within minutes, usually distracted by something interesting or hiding in an obvious place the adults had overlooked. But as the search entered its 10th minute with no sign of Emma, his practiced calm began to crack. This felt different. This felt wrong. The transformation from routine grocery trip to criminal investigation happened with bureaucratic swiftness that felt surreal against the magnitude of what was occurring. Officer Janet Riley arrived within 6 minutes of Patterson's call, her patrol car's red and blue lights casting eerie shadows through the store's large front windows. The familiar grocery store where Maggie had shopped weekly for years suddenly felt like a crime scene, cordoned off from the normal world by the presence of law enforcement and the growing understanding that something terrible had happened. Riley, a 15-year veteran with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, had handled missing child cases before. She knew the statistics. Most children who wandered off were found quickly and safely, but stranger abductions, though rare, typically occurred within the first 30 minutes. The golden hour was already half gone. "Tell me exactly what happened," Riley said, her voice professional but not unkind. She pulled out a small notebook and pen, her eyes never leaving Maggie's face as she recounted the afternoon in precise detail. Every ordinary moment now felt loaded with potential significance. The route through the store, Emma's behavior, the exact timing of when Maggie had last seen her daughter, all of it was dissected and documented with the thoroughness of detectives who understood that the smallest detail might be the key to bringing Emma home. Was anyone paying unusual attention to Emma? Any interactions with strangers? Riley asked. Maggie's mind immediately went to the man at the meat counter, and she described him as best she could. Tall, thin, dark hair, blue work shirt like a mechanic might wear. He had seemed harmless, even kind, but now every smile and friendly comment felt potentially sinister. By the time additional officers arrived, the store had been thoroughly searched multiple times. Every shelf had been moved, every storage area examined, every possible hiding place investigated with the methodical precision of people who understood they were looking for a needle in a haystack. Except the needle was a 5-year-old girl who might already be miles away. Emma wasn't in the building. Someone had taken her. Detective Ray Morrison, who would later become intimately familiar with every detail of Emma's case, took control of the investigation with the efficient urgency of someone who had worked too many similar cases. Roadblocks went up on all major routes out of Cedar Falls. An Amber Alert, one of Iowa's first, broadcast Emma's description across the state. 5 years old, blonde hair in pigtails, blue eyes, purple unicorn t-shirt, red sneakers. The description that would haunt newspaper readers and television viewers, that would be memorized by law enforcement officers and concerned citizens, that would become the defining image of Emma Chen, frozen at age 5. The next several hours blurred together in a sequence Maggie would replay endlessly in the years to come. Police station interviews where she answered the same questions repeatedly, trying to remember details that might bring Emma home. Phone calls to Robert, to her parents, to Emma's teachers and babysitter, expanding circles of people who needed to know that their world had fundamentally changed. The realization that she couldn't go home to an empty apartment, couldn't face Emma's bedroom with its carefully arranged stuffed animals and the unicorn nightlight that would burn uselessly through the night. Robert arrived from Des Moines just after midnight, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from the frantic 3-hour drive. Despite their bitter divorce proceedings, despite the custody battles and lawyers' letters, the shared terror of losing Emma temporarily erased all other grievances. They sat together in the police station's uncomfortable plastic chairs, their hands briefly touching as they struggled to process what felt impossible to accept. Friends and family members began arriving throughout the night, turning the police station into an impromptu gathering of everyone who loved Emma. Maggie's sister drove from Chicago. Robert's parents flew in from Phoenix. Emma's kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, came straight from home in her robe and slippers when she heard the news on the late-night radio broadcast. The community of people whose lives Emma had touched expanded to fill the space, their presence both comforting and heartbreaking. "I should have been watching her more closely," Maggie whispered to Robert during one of the few moments they found themselves alone. "I was looking at tomatoes. Tomatoes. How could I be so careless?" The words tasted like ash in her mouth, the self-recrimination that would become her constant companion for years to come. "This isn't your fault," Robert said firmly, though his own voice was thick with the kind of emotion he rarely displayed. "You're a good mother. The best mother. This is on whoever took her." But even as he spoke the words, they both knew that blame and responsibility were luxuries they couldn't afford right now. Every moment spent on self-accusation was a moment not spent finding Emma. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls on August 19, 1992, the search had expanded to involve multiple law enforcement agencies, volunteer groups, and hundreds of community members who had organized impromptu search parties. The man from the meat counter remained unidentified, despite extensive canvassing of local businesses and review of employment records. No security cameras had captured Emma's disappearance. The store's single surveillance camera covered only the cash register area, leaving the critical moments undocumented. The initial media attention was intense but local. Missing children were tragically common, and without additional developments, Emma's story would likely fade from headlines within days. But for Maggie, time had stopped at 3:47 p.m. on August 18th. Every clock she looked at seemed to tick backwards to that moment when she had turned around and found empty space where her daughter should have been. Days turned into weeks as the investigation followed every possible lead. Witnesses provided conflicting descriptions of vehicles in the parking lot. Tips poured in from across the Midwest, possible sightings that sent investigators racing to distant towns, only to find other blonde children who weren't Emma. Psychics called with visions. Well-meaning strangers sent letters with theories. None of it brought Emma home. The man in the blue work shirt became the focus of intensive investigation. His description was circulated to auto repair shops, factories, and any business where such clothing might be standard uniform. Police reviewed employment records, interviewed customers who had been in the store that day, and followed up on hundreds of tips from people who thought they might have seen him. But he seemed to have vanished as completely as Emma herself, leaving behind only a vague description and the growing certainty that he was connected to her disappearance. Maggie found herself unable to maintain the routines of her previous life. She couldn't return to work, couldn't concentrate on anything beyond the search for Emma. She spent her days at the police station, at search command centers, or driving through neighborhoods looking for any sign of her daughter. Sleep became elusive. When she did manage to doze, she was tormented by dreams where she found Emma in impossible places. Grocery stores that stretched infinitely, parking lots that led nowhere, voices calling for help that she could never quite reach. The support of family and friends was overwhelming, but also exhausting. Everyone wanted to help, to do something, to contribute to bringing Emma home. But their presence also served as constant reminders of what was missing. Children's laughter from the neighbor's yard felt like physical pain. Television commercials featuring families felt like personal attacks. The normal world, with its assumptions about safety and predictability, had revealed itself to be an illusion. By October, as autumn painted Cedar Falls in brilliant reds and golds that Emma would have loved, the active investigation began to wind down. Detective Morrison had followed every lead, interviewed every possible witness, and exhausted every avenue of inquiry. The case remained open, but the daily urgency that had characterized the first weeks gradually gave way to the grinding routine of a cold case. Emma's photograph joined the growing collection of missing children whose faces stared out from bulletin boards in police stations and post offices across Iowa. The holidays that year were unbearable. Thanksgiving dinner sat untouched as family members struggled to find things to be grateful for. Christmas morning arrived without the excited squeals and wrapping paper chaos that Emma had always brought to the day. Her presents sat unopened under the tree, toys and clothes that Maggie had bought in the desperate hope that Emma would be home in time to receive them. The empty spaces where Emma should have been felt larger than the spaces she had filled, creating an absence that seemed to consume everything around it. Robert and Maggie's relationship, already strained by divorce proceedings, couldn't survive the additional pressure of their shared tragedy. They blamed themselves and, in their darkest moments, each other. Robert threw himself into work, taking a transfer to Florida, where he could escape the constant reminders of Cedar Falls. Maggie remained, unable to leave the place where Emma had last been seen, terrified that moving away would somehow make it impossible for Emma to find her way home. The second year was harder than the first. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by the grinding reality of indefinite uncertainty. Well-meaning friends suggested grief counseling, support groups, ways to move forward. But how could she move forward when Emma might still be out there, might still need her? How could she accept that her daughter was gone when there was no proof, no closure, no grave to visit? Maggie's life restructured itself around the search for Emma. She learned about missing children organizations, DNA databases, age progression technology. She networked with other parents of missing children, sharing information and emotional support. She became an expert in the bureaucracy of disappearance, which agencies to contact, which forms to file, how to keep a case from being forgotten in the endless stream of new tragedies that competed for official attention. The age progression photos were both a blessing and a curse. Seeing computer-generated images of what Emma might look like at 7, 10, 13, 16 felt like watching her daughter grow up in an alternate universe. Each new image represented years of missed birthdays, lost hugs, conversations that would never happen. But they also kept hope alive. Somewhere out there, Emma might be becoming the person these images suggested, might be growing up and remembering her mother who never stopped looking for her, technology evolved, and so did the search methodologies. Emma's case was entered into national databases. DNA samples were collected and stored for future comparison. The internet created new possibilities for spreading information and connecting with other families facing similar ordeals. But it also created new sources of false hope. Amateur investigators who claimed to have found Emma, scammers who preyed on desperate parents, conspiracy theorists who turned tragedy into entertainment. Detective Morrison retired in 1997, passing Emma's file to Detective Sarah Kim with the solemn promise that the case would never be closed. Kim brought fresh eyes and new techniques to the investigation, but the fundamental problem remained. Emma had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and the unwavering love of a mother who refused to give up. Maggie eventually found ways to channel her pain into purpose. She remarried in 1998, a kind social worker named David, who understood that loving her meant accepting Emma's permanent presence in their lives. Together, they started a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting families of missing children, providing the kind of practical and emotional support that Maggie had desperately needed in those first terrible weeks after Emma's disappearance. The work was meaningful but painful. Every family they helped reminded Maggie of her own loss, but it also gave her a sense that Emma's disappearance hadn't been completely without purpose. If her tragedy could help other families navigate their own nightmares, if her experience could spare other parents even a fraction of the confusion and despair she had endured, then perhaps some meaning could be extracted from the senseless loss. Years accumulated like sediment, each one adding weight to the growing certainty that Emma was gone forever. Maggie learned to function within this reality while never quite accepting it. She attended therapy, developed coping mechanisms, built a life that had room for both grief and joy. But every phone call from an unknown number, every knock at the door, every news story about found children sent her heart racing with the possibility that this might be the moment Emma came home. By 2010, Emma would have been 23 years old, a college graduate, perhaps married, possibly with children of her own. Maggie sometimes imagined walking down a street and seeing a young woman with familiar blue eyes, recognizing something indefinable but unmistakable in her face. These fantasies were both comfort and torture, keeping Emma alive in her heart while highlighting the vast emptiness of not knowing. The case review in 2015 brought new hope and old pain. Detective Kim, now a seasoned investigator with her own collection of unsolved cases, applied fresh techniques to Emma's disappearance. New witness interviews, updated forensic analysis, comparison with similar cases that had been solved in the intervening years. But the fundamental mystery remained. How had a 5-year-old girl vanished from a crowded grocery store without anyone seeing her leave? Social media created new possibilities for spreading Emma's story. Her case was featured on websites dedicated to missing persons, shared thousands of times on platforms that hadn't existed when she disappeared. Amateur investigators and concerned citizens created online communities dedicated to solving cold cases, bringing fresh perspectives and renewed attention to Emma's disappearance. But for every legitimate lead these efforts generated, there were dozens of false sightings and conspiracy theories that had to be investigated and debunked. Maggie, now in her 50s, had learned to live with uncertainty in ways she never could have imagined as a young mother. Her hair had gone grey, her face lined with years of worry and hope deferred. She and David had moved to Portland, Oregon, where they ran their non-profit and tried to build a life that honored both Emma's memory and their own need for some measure of peace. The dreams never stopped. Emma appeared regularly in Maggie's sleep, sometimes as the 5-year-old who had vanished, sometimes as the adult she might have become. In these dreams, Emma was always just out of reach, calling for help from places Maggie couldn't access, needing rescue from situations that made no logical sense. Maggie would wake from these dreams with her heart pounding and tears on her cheeks, the grief as fresh as it had been 25 years earlier. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2024, 32 years and 7 months after Emma's disappearance. Maggie was in her Portland office, reviewing grant applications for their non-profit when her cell phone rang with an unfamiliar Iowa number. Something compelled her to answer rather than let it go to voicemail. Perhaps the same intuition that had made her turn around in the grocery store all those years ago, just a moment too late. "Hello," she said, expecting a telemarketer or wrong number. "Is this Margaret Chen?" The voice was official, professional, carrying the weight of authority that still made Maggie's heart race after all these years. "This is Detective Kim with the Cedar Falls Police Department." Maggie's hand trembled as she gripped the phone. In 32 years, no call from the police had brought good news. Missing children who were found alive after decades were the stuff of movies and miracle stories, not the reality she had learned to accept. "Yes, this is Maggie. Is there news about Emma?" "Mrs. Chen, I need you to sit down. We've received some information that I think you need to hear directly from me." Detective Kim's voice was careful, measured, but Maggie could hear something underneath the professional tone. Excitement, perhaps, or the kind of controlled urgency that came with genuinely significant developments. Maggie sank into her desk chair, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear over the blood rushing in her ears. What kind of information? She had learned to manage her expectations over the years, to protect herself from the crushing disappointment that came with false leads and mistaken identities. "We received a voicemail yesterday on our tip line. Mrs. Chen," the caller identified herself as Emma Chen. "She said she's been living in California under a different name and that she's ready to come forward." The words seemed to float in the air, refusing to attach to meaning. Maggie opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. After 32 years of silence, of wondering and searching and grieving, her daughter had spoken. The impossibility of it made her dizzy. "Mrs. Chen, are you there?" Yes, I'm here. Are you sure? How do you know it's really her?" The questions tumbled out, decades of protective skepticism warring with desperate hope. She had received false leads before, had her heart broken by well-meaning people who thought they had found Emma, only to discover they were wrong. She provided details about the day she disappeared that were never made public. She mentioned the purple unicorn shirt, the fact that you were looking at tomatoes, even the name of the store employee who helped search for her, Kyle. She also said she remembers you always singing "You Are My Sunshine" when you put her to bed. Tears streamed down Maggie's face as that last detail hit home like a physical blow. She had never told anyone about that song, not even Robert. It was their private ritual, just between mother and daughter, sacred and secret. No one else could have known about those quiet moments in Emma's bedroom, the gentle melody that had been their special connection. What did she say? In the voicemail, what exactly did she say? Maggie's voice was barely a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow break the spell, might make this impossible gift disappear. Detective Kim's voice was gentle, understanding the magnitude of what she was sharing. She said, "My name is Emma Chen, and I think you've been looking for me for a very long time. I'm ready to come home now, if you'll have me." The room spun around Maggie as 32 years of carefully controlled emotions threatened to overwhelm her completely. Every wall she had built to protect herself from hope, every defense mechanism she had developed to function despite uncertainty, crumbled in an instant. "Where is she? Is she safe? I need to see her." She left a callback number. "We've verified it belongs to a woman named Sarah Mitchell in Sacramento, California. Mrs. Chen, We need to proceed carefully here. We'll arrange for DNA testing to confirm identity, and we'll need to investigate the circumstances of her disappearance in the years since. This is unprecedented. But if this is really Emma, it's her, Maggie whispered with absolute certainty. I know it's her. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of frantic preparations and cautious hope. Detective Kim arranged for Maggie and David to fly to Sacramento, where they would meet with local authorities and potentially with the woman claiming to be Emma. DNA samples were expedited through the lab, though results would still take several days. Media had not yet caught wind of the development, giving them a brief window of privacy to navigate this miracle. David handled the practical arrangements, flights, hotels, time off from work, while Maggie struggled to process the emotional reality. Emma was alive. Emma was 37 years old. Emma remembered being 5 and remembered her mother singing to her. The daughter she had grieved for 32 years had been living her own life, growing up without her, becoming a person Maggie had never had the chance to know. The questions multiplied with each passing hour. What had happened that day in the grocery store? Who had taken Emma, and where had she been all these years? Why was she coming forward now? What kind of life had she lived, and what kind of person had she become? The little girl who had loved unicorns and asked for cereal with toys inside had become a mystery wrapped in 3 decades of unknown experiences. As their plane descended toward Sacramento, Maggie stared out the window at the sprawling city below and tried to prepare herself for meeting a stranger who was also her daughter. 32 years of growth and change separated them. Emma had lived an entire lifetime that Maggie had not witnessed. Would they recognize each other? Would there be any trace of the 5-year-old in the 37-year-old woman? Would Emma still call her mommy, or had that word been claimed by someone else? The meeting was arranged at the Sacramento Police Department, neutral territory where both security and privacy could be maintained. Maggie sat in a small conference room, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking, while David squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. Through the window, she could see Detective Kim speaking with another woman in the hallway, a woman with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a simple blue sweater. When the door opened, time seemed to stop. The woman who entered was 37 years old, of medium height, with the same blue eyes that had haunted Maggie's dreams for 32 years. Her face was different, of course, shaped by decades of living that Maggie had not witnessed, but something in her expression, the way she held her head, the slight dimple in her left cheek that appeared when she smiled nervously, was unmistakably familiar. "Hello, Mom," the woman said softly, and Maggie heard her 5-year-old daughter's voice beneath the adult words. They didn't rush toward each other like in movies. The reality was more complicated, more delicate. Instead, they sat across a small table, studying each other's faces with the intensity of people trying to reconcile memory with reality. Maggie wanted to memorize every detail, to understand how the child she remembered had become this grown woman, to bridge the impossible gap of 32 lost years. "Tell me about the song," Maggie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the test she hadn't even known she was going to give, the proof that would convince her heart what her eyes could hardly believe. Emma, Sarah, smiled, and suddenly Maggie could see her 5-year-old daughter's gap-toothed grin shining through the adult features. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray." Her voice cracked on the familiar words, and she touched a spot just above her left eyebrow. "You used to sing it every night, and you'd kiss my forehead right here, right at the end." Maggie lost the battle against her tears, and across the table, her daughter, grown, alive, real, cried with her. 32 years of separation dissolved in that moment, replaced by the simple truth that love had survived everything: time, distance, loss, and the seemingly impossible journey that had brought them back together. The story that emerged over the following days was both heartbreaking and miraculous, a testament to the complexity of human nature and the unexpected ways that tragedy and love could intertwine. Emma had been taken by Marcus Webb, the man from the meat counter whose mental illness had convinced him he was rescuing children from inadequate homes. He had watched Maggie and Emma in the store, became fixated on what he perceived as maternal neglect when Maggie became absorbed in selecting produce, and impulsively acted on his delusion that Emma needed saving. Webb had driven Emma to California, where he lived with his sister, Ruth Mitchell, in a modest house outside Sacramento. Ruth, a childless woman in her 40s who worked as a pediatric nurse, initially believed Webb's story that Emma was his daughter from a previous relationship and that he had gained custody from an unfit mother. The story was plausible enough, and Ruth's professional experience with troubled families made her sympathetic to what she thought was a father protecting his child. By the time Ruth realized the truth that Webb had kidnapped Emma, she had grown to love the little girl and couldn't bear the thought of losing her or seeing Webb, her only remaining family, arrested and institutionalized. Webb's mental state was deteriorating rapidly, his paranoid delusions becoming more severe and dangerous. Ruth made the impossible decision to send him away, telling him that Emma would be better off with her than in foster care while he faced kidnapping charges. Webb agreed to disappear, understanding on some level that his presence endangered both Emma and Ruth. He vanished from their lives when Emma was 7, leaving behind only a forwarding address that led nowhere. Emma later learned he had died by suicide in a motel room in Nevada in 1995, taking the complete truth about her past with him to the grave. Ruth legally changed Emma's name to Sarah Mitchell and raised her as her own daughter with a combination of fierce love and overprotective fear. She homeschooled Emma to limit her exposure to people who might recognize her from missing person reports. She moved them to different neighborhoods periodically, always claiming job transfers or family needs. She created a complete alternate history for Emma, complete with false documentation and carefully constructed lies about her origins. Emma grew up believing her birth parents had abandoned her, that Ruth had rescued her from a life of neglect and abuse. Ruth's background in pediatric nursing gave credibility to her claims about Emma's supposed traumatic early childhood. She spoke vaguely about Emma's birth mother being young and unprepared for parenthood, about a father who had been abusive and dangerous. These lies were told with such conviction and supported by such genuine love that Emma never questioned them. The deception was so complete that Emma had no conscious memory of her life before Ruth. The trauma of the kidnapping, combined with the psychological manipulation necessary to maintain the lie, had effectively erased her memories of Maggie and her early childhood in Iowa. She remembered fragments, dreams about singing, vague impressions of someone with dark hair who smelled like flowers, but Ruth explained these as fantasies or memories of temporary foster families. Ruth provided Emma with stability, education, and unconditional love, but always within carefully controlled boundaries. Emma was discouraged from making friends, from participating in activities that might expose her to public attention, from asking too many questions about their past. Ruth's fears about discovery created a household atmosphere of subtle but constant anxiety, where love was mixed with secrecy and protection came at the cost of freedom. As Emma grew older, Ruth's explanations for their isolated lifestyle became more elaborate. They moved frequently because Ruth was a traveling nurse. They didn't have extended family because Ruth's parents had disowned her for taking in Emma. They avoided social media and public records because Emma's birth father was dangerous and might try to find them. Each lie built upon the others, creating a complex mythology that explained away any inconsistencies or questions. Emma accepted these explanations because Ruth was the only mother she remembered, because the love between them was genuine and profound, and because the alternative, questioning everything she had been told about her identity, was too frightening to contemplate. She built her sense of self around Ruth's version of their story, creating an identity as Sarah Mitchell that was both authentic in its emotional truth and completely false in its factual foundation. The truth began to unravel in 2018, when Ruth was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. As her illness progressed and her death became inevitable, Ruth was tormented by the weight of the secrets she had carried for 26 years. She began leaving subtle clues for Emma to find. Newspaper clippings hidden in books, old photographs tucked into boxes of medical records, documents that didn't quite match the stories she had told. Emma initially dismissed these discoveries as confusion related to Ruth's medication or the stress of her illness. But as Ruth's condition worsened, the clues became more obvious, more deliberate. A birth certificate with the name Emma Chen. Missing person flyers with a photograph that looked remarkably like Emma's childhood pictures. News articles about a little girl who had disappeared from a grocery store in Iowa. Ruth died in hospice care in March 2019, taking most of the truth with her, but leaving behind a letter that Emma discovered while sorting through her belongings. In it, Ruth confessed everything: the kidnapping, the lies, the decades of deception that had kept Emma from her real family. She expressed her love for Emma and her certainty that she had given her a better life than she would have had otherwise. But she also acknowledged the magnitude of what she had stolen and begged Emma's forgiveness. "I took you from your mother," Ruth wrote, "and I gave you to myself. I told myself it was for your own good, that Marcus had saved you from something terrible, but I know now that the only terrible thing in your life was us. Your real mother loved you, and she never stopped looking for you. I was too afraid and too selfish to give you back to her, but now that I'm dying, I can't bear the thought of taking this secret to my grave. You have a choice to make, and whatever you decide, I will love you forever." The revelation shattered Emma's understanding of everything she thought she knew about herself. The woman she had loved as a mother had been complicit in her kidnapping. The life she had built as Sarah Mitchell was founded on lies. Somewhere in Iowa, a woman named Margaret Chen had spent 27 years searching for a daughter who had been alive and well in California, growing up under a different name. Emma spent the next 5 years processing this information with the help of therapists who specialized in complex trauma and identity issues. She researched Maggie extensively, learning about her volunteer work with missing children, her marriage to David, her decades of advocacy and hope. She felt overwhelming guilt about the pain her absence had caused, but also anger about the choices that had been made for her by adults who claimed to love her. The decision to make contact was agonizing. Emma had built a life as Sarah Mitchell. She had friends, a career as a nurse, following in Ruth's footsteps, a serious relationship with a man who knew nothing about her true identity. Coming forward would mean not only reuniting with Maggie, but also explaining to everyone in her current life that she wasn't who they thought she was. But the weight of knowing that Maggie was still out there, still hoping, still searching, eventually became unbearable. Emma realized that her silence was continuing the cycle of lies that had defined her life. In March 2024, exactly 5 years after Ruth's death, she finally found the courage to pick up the phone and call the Cedar Falls Police Department. The DNA results confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. Sarah Mitchell was Emma Chen. The reunion sparked international media attention, but Maggie and Emma insisted on privacy as they navigated the complex process of rebuilding a relationship that had been interrupted by 3 decades of separation, lies, and growth. Emma returned to Portland with Maggie and David, moving into the guest room that had been kept ready for 32 years, just in case. The adjustment was difficult for everyone involved. Emma struggled with calling Maggie Mom. Ruth had been her mother in every way that mattered, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. Maggie struggled with accepting that her daughter had been raised by the people who had stolen her, that Emma's love for Ruth was genuine and unchangeable. They attended family therapy together, working through the complex emotions surrounding their reunion. Emma felt guilty about her life with Ruth, about the happiness she had experienced while Maggie suffered. Maggie felt guilty about resenting Ruth, about wishing Emma's childhood had been different when it was clear that Ruth had genuinely loved and cared for her. "I used to dream about you," Emma told Maggie one evening as they sat on the back porch, watching the Portland sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "I never understood why, until Ruth told me the truth. I think some part of me always remembered, even when I couldn't access those memories consciously." Maggie reached over and took her daughter's hand, marveling at how it felt both foreign and familiar. Emma's hands were those of a woman who had lived her own life, who had experiences and relationships and memories that didn't include her biological mother. But they were also the hands of the 5-year-old who had reached for apples in a grocery store, grown and changed, but fundamentally the same person. "I dreamed about you too," Maggie said, "every night for 32 years. Sometimes you were still 5. Sometimes you were older. I always wondered what you would look like, what kind of person you would become. I'm so proud of who you are, Emma." Ruth. Ruth raised you well, despite everything. It was perhaps the most difficult admission Maggie had ever made, acknowledging that the woman who had been complicit in Emma's kidnapping had also been a loving mother to her. But it was also necessary for healing, for accepting the complex reality of their situation rather than the simple narrative of good and evil that most people preferred. They had lost so much time, missed so many milestones. Emma had graduated high school, attended community college, worked various jobs, even had serious relationships. She had navigated the challenges of adolescence and young adulthood without her biological mother's guidance, had developed her own values and beliefs and ways of seeing the world. But they also had something precious and rare: the opportunity to know each other as adults, to build new memories while honoring the ones that had been stolen. The case officially closed, with Webb's posthumous identification as Emma's kidnapper and Ruth Mitchell's classification as an accessory after the fact. Ruth was beyond prosecution, having died 5 years earlier, but her role in maintaining the kidnapping was documented for the record. Detective Kim noted that this was only the second time in her 20-year career that a missing child had been recovered alive after so many years. Emma kept Ruth's last name as part of her own, becoming Emma Chen Mitchell. It was her way of honoring both the woman who had raised her and the woman who had given birth to her, of refusing to choose between the two mothers who had shaped her life in different ways. She enrolled in graduate school to become a psychiatric nurse practitioner, inspired by her own therapy experience and her desire to help others process complex trauma. Robert flew in from Florida for an awkward but emotional reunion with the daughter he had thought was dead for 32 years. Emma had no memory of him, but she could see her own eyes reflected in his face, could recognize gestures and expressions that had been passed down through genetics. They began building a relationship slowly, carefully, without the pressure of trying to recapture a bond that had been severed when she was 5 years old. The media attention was intense, but brief. Missing child cases that ended happily were rare enough to capture public imagination, but the details of Emma's story, the mental illness, the loving kidnapper, the decades of deception, were too complex for simple headlines. Most people preferred stories with clear villains and heroes, not the messy reality of damaged people making impossible choices out of love, fear, and desperation. Emma met James, her future husband, in a support group for people dealing with complex family issues. He understood the challenge of rebuilding identity after discovering that your entire life story was constructed on lies. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual understanding of how healing could happen even when the wounds were decades old and seemingly permanent. On August 18, 2024, exactly 32 years after Emma's disappearance, mother and daughter returned to Cedar Falls together. Patterson's family market had closed in 2003, replaced by a chain supermarket, but the building remained largely unchanged. They stood in the parking lot where their lives had been fractured, now holding each other's hands as whole people rather than the broken individuals they had been for so long. "Do you remember being scared that day?" Maggie asked, studying the building where her nightmare had begun and, in a way, finally ended. Emma considered the question carefully, trying to access memories that were both deeply buried and fundamental to who she had become. "I remember being confused more than scared. The man, Webb, told me you had sent him to get me, that you were waiting in the car outside. By the time I realized something was wrong, we were already hours away from you." They visited the cemetery, where a small marker had been placed for Emma on her 18th birthday, when she was legally declared dead. The inscription read, "Emma Chen, beloved daughter, forever 5 years old." They arranged to have it removed, a final acknowledgement that Emma had lived and grown and survived, that she was no longer frozen in time at the moment of her disappearance. As they drove away from Cedar Falls for the last time, Emma asked about the extended family she had never known, grandparents who had died still hoping for her return, aunts and uncles who had searched for her, cousins who had grown up hearing stories about the little girl who had vanished. Maggie promised to reconnect her with the family members who remained, to help her understand the web of relationships she had been born into but never had the chance to experience. The story that began with a 5-year-old girl vanishing between the produce and dairy sections had become something larger and more complex, a testament to the endurance of love, the unpredictable ways that tragedy and healing could intertwine, and the possibility that even the most broken situations could sometimes be mended. Emma's voice on that police voicemail had carried across 32 years of silence, calling her mother back to a hope she had never quite abandoned. In her new life in Portland, Emma balanced her graduate studies with helping Maggie and David expand their nonprofit to include support for found children and their families, a population that faced unique challenges in readjusting to lives they had never known they were missing. Her own experience gave her insights that no textbook could provide, and her presence helped other families understand that reunion, while miraculous, was also complicated and required patience, therapy, and unconditional love. Some evenings, as they sat together planning Emma's wedding or discussing her career goals, Maggie would catch herself humming, "You Are My Sunshine." Emma would smile and join in, their voices blending in a harmony that time had never truly broken, only temporarily silenced. The song that had once been their private ritual had become something larger, a bridge between the past they had lost and the future they were building together, one note at a time. The groceries that Maggie had abandoned in Patterson's family market in 1992 had long since been thrown away, but the love that had driven her to shop for her daughter's dinner had remained fresh and vital across 3 decades. It had survived doubt, despair, and the gradual erosion of hope. It had waited patiently through police investigations and false leads, through birthdays and holidays marked by absence, through the slow acceptance that Emma might never come home. And when a voice finally called across the years, that love was still there, unchanged and unchanging, ready to welcome home a daughter who had never really been lost, only temporarily misplaced in the vast complexity of human frailty and the unexpected ways that broken people could still love each other, imperfectly but completely, across impossible distances and unimaginable time.